At 11:40 p.m. on a black, freezing night in the North Atlantic, the largest moving object ever built by human hands felt something it was never supposed to feel. A shudder, a scrape, a whisper of steel against ice. Most passengers didn't even wake up. Some laughed. A few kicked a piece of ice across the deck like it was a party favor. Nobody screamed. Nobody ran. They had been told this ship could not sink. In less than 3 hours, that lie would kill more than 1,500 people. This is the full story of the Titanic. Not just the night it died, but the decade of ambition, ego, and human error that built it, and the century of grief, mystery, and myth that followed it to the bottom of the ocean. Before there was a wreck, there was a dream. The dream of a ship so large it would make every other vessel on Earth look small. A floating palace built to carry the richest men in the world across the Atlantic in absolute comfort, and to carry the poorest families toward a new life in America, packed 3 decks below, dreaming their own version of the same future. For a few years, that dream actually worked. The Titanic was real. It sailed. It carried real people with real names, real families, real fears, and real hopes. And then, in the middle of the ocean, at the edge of midnight, all of it collided with something far older and far more powerful than human engineering: ice, physics, and time. This is the story of how the unsinkable ship was built, and how, in under 3 hours, the sea proved that nothing built by human pride is ever truly unsinkable. To understand why the Titanic existed at all, you have to understand the world that built it. The early 1900s were an age of excess. Railroads had conquered continents. Electricity was rewiring cities. Steel towers scraped the sky in New York and Chicago. And crossing the Atlantic Ocean had become the ultimate status symbol of the era, a floating extension of wealth, empire, and national pride. 2 shipping companies were locked in a brutal, glittering war for dominance of that ocean. On one side stood Cunard, the British line that had just built 2 record-breaking ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, vessels so fast they could cross from Europe to America in under 5 days, stealing headlines and stealing passengers. On the other side stood White Star Line and its chairman, a sharp, ambitious man named J. Bruce Ismay. Ismay didn't want to compete on speed. He wanted to win a different way entirely. He wanted to build ships so enormous, so luxurious, so overwhelming in scale, that speed wouldn't matter. Why race across the ocean when you could glide across it in a floating hotel with Turkish baths, a swimming pool, and a la carte restaurants that rivaled the finest establishments in Paris? In 1907, according to popular accounts of the era, Ismay had dinner with Lord William Peary, chairman of the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast. Over that dinner, the idea for 3 sister ships was born: Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic, 3 vessels that would be the largest, most luxurious ships the world had ever seen. The Titanic was never meant to be the fastest ship afloat. It was meant to be the grandest. And in the culture of 1912, grandeur was its own kind of armor. Nobody believed a ship this magnificent, this modern, this expensive could possibly fail. That belief would turn out to be the most dangerous cargo on board. In the shipyard town of Belfast, Northern Ireland, a construction site rose that dwarfed everything around it. 2 massive gantry cranes, nicknamed Samson and Goliath, towered over the docks of Harland and Wolff. Beneath them, over the course of nearly 3 years, roughly 3,000 workers swarmed daily over a steel skeleton that grew larger than any building most of them had ever seen. The scale is almost impossible to picture even now. The Titanic would stretch to over 880 feet long, nearly the length of 4 football fields laid end to end. It would rise 11 stories from keel to bridge. Its 4 funnels, though only 3 actually functioned, were each large enough to drive 2 train locomotives through side by side. The work was brutal and dangerous. Riveters hammered in an estimated 3 million iron and steel rivets by hand, the sound echoing across Belfast like a constant industrial drumbeat. Men worked in freezing cold, in scorching heat, on scaffolding hundreds of feet in the air, with none of the safety regulations we'd expect today. At least a few dozen workers were injured or killed during construction, crushed by falling steel plates, struck by machinery, or lost in falls from the towering hull. Their deaths barely made the newspapers. The ship was the story. The men building it were simply part of the machine. Belfast took enormous pride in what was rising from its shipyard. Local families would walk down to the docks on Sundays just to stand and stare at the growing hull, unable to comprehend that something this size could ever actually float, let alone move. And still, the ship kept growing. Deck by deck, plate by plate. Nobody standing on those docks in 1910 could have imagined that this same hull, gleaming and new, would be resting broken on the ocean floor in less than 3 years. The Titanic wasn't just big. It was, on paper, one of the safest ships ever designed. Its hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments, sealed off from each other by heavy steel doors that could be closed instantly from the bridge with the flip of an electric switch. The idea was simple and, in theory, brilliant. If the hull was ever breached, water would flood only the damaged compartments, while the rest of the ship stayed dry and afloat. Engineers calculated that the Titanic could survive with any 2 of these compartments completely flooded. Some accounts even claimed it could survive 4. It was this design that led one shipbuilding trade magazine to describe the ship before it ever set sail as practically unsinkable. That phrase spread like wildfire. Newspapers repeated it, passengers repeated it, crew members repeated it to nervous travelers as a comforting fact rather than a marketing phrase. But here is the detail almost nobody understood at the time. The walls between those 16 compartments did not extend all the way up to the top deck. They only rose a few decks high. If enough compartments filled with water, the ship would tip forward, and water would simply spill over the tops of the walls into the next compartment, and the next, and the next, like water pouring over the divisions in an ice cube tray. The system wasn't built to survive that kind of damage. It was built to survive a single contained puncture, a collision with another ship, a fire, a small accident. Nobody who designed the Titanic ever imagined a wound 300 feet long, slicing open compartment after compartment in a single stroke. Nobody imagined an iceberg. On the 21st of May, 1911, more than 100,000 people packed the banks of the River Lagan in Belfast to witness something almost nobody had seen before: the launch of the largest man-made moving object in history. There was no christening ceremony that day, no champagne bottle smashed against the bow, as tradition usually demanded. White Star Line simply didn't believe in it. The hull, painted black, slid down 22 tons of soap, tallow, and train oil packed onto the slipway to reduce friction. At exactly 12:13 in the afternoon, hydraulic triggers released, and Titanic's hull began to move. Witnesses described the sound as something between a roar and a groan, deep, metallic, and enormous, as 60,000 tons of unfinished steel slid backward into the water for the very first time. It took only 62 seconds for the hull to travel down the slipway and settle into the river. The crowd erupted. Children were lifted onto shoulders. Hats flew into the air. For one afternoon, Belfast celebrated the birth of a machine that felt like it belonged to the future itself. But the ship that slid into the water that day was still just a hollow steel shell. No engines, no funnels, no luxury, no life. It would take nearly another full year of fitting out at the dock before Titanic was ready to carry a single passenger. A year of installing boilers, a year of laying marble in first-class bathrooms, a year of building a ship meant to be remembered for its comfort, not its danger. Nobody in that cheering crowd could have known they were watching the birth of one of the most famous tragedies in human history. Nearly a year later, on the morning of April 10, 1912, the docks of Southampton, England, buzzed with a different kind of energy. This was departure day. Porters wheeled steamer trunks the size of small wardrobes up the gangways. Stewards in crisp white uniforms checked names against passenger manifests. Families said tearful goodbyes on the dock, some of them for what they believed would be a short separation, others forever, as emigrants boarded for a new life across the ocean. The Titanic carried roughly 2,200 people that day, passengers and crew combined, though the exact number is still debated by historians due to incomplete records, late cancellations, and last-minute crew changes. The ship carried 3 distinct worlds inside one hull. First class occupied the upper decks, where wealthy industrialists, socialites, and aristocrats settled into staterooms paneled in oak and walnut, with private promenades, a heated swimming pool, a gymnasium equipped with mechanical horses and rowing machines, and a first-class dining saloon that could seat more than 500 people beneath a domed glass ceiling. Among these first-class passengers were some of the wealthiest people alive, men like John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest men in America, and Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to a mining fortune. Their combined wealth on board that single ship has been estimated at hundreds of millions of dollars in the currency of the time. Second class, one deck below, was still remarkably comfortable, arguably nicer than first class on most other ships of the era, with its own library, smoking room, and dining saloon. And far below, in third class, more than 700 passengers packed into smaller cabins and shared berths. Many were emigrants from Ireland, Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East, carrying everything they owned in a single trunk, chasing the same dream that had built America itself, the dream of starting over. They were separated from the upper decks not just by distance, but by locked gates, a detail that would matter terribly in just 4 days' time. At noon, the ship's whistles let out a deafening blast, and the Titanic slowly pulled away from the dock. Almost immediately, something strange happened. The enormous suction created by Titanic's hull nearly pulled a smaller ship, the New York, from its moorings, snapping mooring ropes and sending the smaller vessel drifting dangerously close to a collision before quick action from tugboats pulled it clear. It was a small, almost forgotten incident, but some would later look back on it as an omen. After stops in Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown, Ireland, to collect final passengers, the Titanic turned west into open ocean on the evening of April 11, 1912, with all 2,200 souls now aboard. For the next 3 days, life aboard the Titanic settled into a strange floating rhythm, part luxury hotel, part small city, moving quietly across the dark Atlantic at roughly 22 knots. In first class, the days blurred into an endless parade of comfort. Breakfast was served in the a la carte restaurant, an exclusive dining venue modeled after the finest Parisian cafes. Afternoons were spent reading in the first-class lounge, its walls carved with intricate Louis XV-style paneling, or relaxing in the Turkish bath, heated by furnaces buried deep in the ship's boiler rooms. Wealthy passengers dressed for dinner in gowns and tuxedos, dining on dishes like oysters, roasted duckling, and pâté de foie gras, while a small orchestra played softly in the background. The same 8 musicians who would, 4 nights later, become one of the most haunting symbols in maritime history. Down in second class, families played card games, attended religious services on Sunday, and enjoyed meals that most passengers considered better than first class on any other ship afloat. And in third class, the atmosphere was louder, warmer, and in many ways more alive. Passengers gathered in the general room for informal dances, accompanied by a lone piano or fiddle. Children ran through narrow corridors. Strangers from a dozen different countries who barely shared a language found ways to laugh together anyway. Meanwhile, deep in the belly of the ship, an entirely different world operated in silence and heat. Nearly 200 firemen and trimmers shoveled coal into 29 massive boilers, working in suffocating temperatures to keep the ship's engines turning. It was some of the hardest, most dangerous labor on board, and the men doing it would never see a single first-class deck. Above them all, on the bridge, Captain Edward John Smith commanded the ship with the calm authority of a man nearing the end of a long and celebrated career. This was meant to be his final voyage before retirement, the crowning achievement of a lifetime at sea. He had no idea it would become the most infamous voyage in maritime history instead. By the fourth day at sea, the temperature outside had begun to drop sharply, and somewhere ahead of them, quietly drifting south through the darkness, an iceberg was already waiting. Throughout the day on April 14, 1912, the Titanic's wireless operators received message after message from other ships in the area, warning of dangerous ice fields directly in their path. The steamship Coronia reported icebergs and field ice. The Baltic warned of large quantities of ice. The America reported passing 2 enormous icebergs. Later that evening, the Californian, a smaller steamer, reported that it had stopped completely, boxed in by ice on all sides, and warned the Titanic directly over radio. Some of these warnings reached the bridge, others didn't. The Titanic's wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, were employees not of White Star Line, but of the Marconi Wireless Company, and their priority that night was clear. First-class passengers were paying enormous sums to send personal telegrams back to friends and family in America, and the backlog of these private messages was enormous. At one point, when the Californian's operator tried to send another ice warning, Phillips, buried under a mountain of passenger messages and irritated by the interruption, reportedly snapped back over the wireless for the smaller ship to stop jamming his signal. He was working important traffic. The Californian's radio operator, discouraged, shut down his wireless set for the night and went to bed. It was a decision that would matter enormously in just a few hours. Meanwhile, Captain Smith, aware of the ice warnings, made no significant reduction in speed. The Titanic continued forward at roughly 22 knots through darkening, increasingly frigid waters, a decision that reflected not recklessness exactly, but the deep, almost unquestioned confidence of the era. Ships had encountered ice before, captains had years of experience navigating it, and besides, this was Titanic. This was the ship that could not sink. As night fell, the temperature outside plunged toward freezing. The ocean itself turned unusually calm and glassy, so smooth, in fact, that lookouts would later testify there were no waves breaking against the base of any icebergs to help reveal their position in the dark. It was, in the cruelest possible way, a perfect night for disaster. At 10 o'clock that evening, 2 lookouts named Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee climbed into the crow's nest, high above the forward deck. They had no binoculars. The ones normally kept for lookout use had been misplaced earlier in the voyage, locked in a cabinet whose key had gone missing with a crew member who'd been reassigned before departure. They would be searching the black Atlantic night with nothing but their own eyes. At 11:39 p.m., Frederick Fleet suddenly saw something ahead in the darkness. A shape, large, black, rising out of the water directly in the ship's path. He rang the crow's nest bell 3 times. the signal for danger dead ahead, and grabbed the telephone connecting to the bridge. "Iceberg, right ahead," he said. The response from the bridge was simple: "Thank you." It was 11:40 p.m. First Officer William Murdoch, on duty on the bridge, reacted almost instantly, ordering the engines reversed, and the wheel turned hard to steer the ship away from the looming shape ahead. But the Titanic weighed over 52,000 tons, moving at more than 20 knots. It was not a car that could swerve. It was closer to trying to stop a moving mountain. For 37 agonizing seconds, the crew watched the iceberg grow larger in the darkness as the ship slowly, too slowly, began turning. Then, at 11:40 p.m., the Titanic's starboard side scraped along the submerged base of the iceberg, the massive bulk of the ice hidden almost entirely beneath the waterline, invisible until it was far too late. Most passengers felt almost nothing. A slight shudder, a faint grinding vibration through the floor. In the first-class smoking room, a card game barely paused. On the third-class decks, some passengers thought it was exciting enough to run outside and kick pieces of fallen ice across the deck like children playing with snow. Nobody understood, in those first few minutes, what had actually just happened below the waterline. The iceberg's underwater ice had sliced open a series of thin gashes and popped rivets along roughly 300 feet of the ship's starboard hull. Not one single dramatic tear, but a scattering of small breaches across 6 of the 16 watertight compartments. It was the worst possible kind of damage, striking the exact vulnerability nobody had designed for. Thomas Andrews, the ship's chief naval architect from Harland and Wolff, was aboard for this maiden voyage, quietly proud of the vessel he had helped design. Within minutes of the collision, he was called to inspect the damage personally alongside Captain Smith. Standing in the mailroom, watching water pour in and mailbags already floating, Andrews did the math in his head. 6 compartments flooding. The ship's design could survive 4. He turned to Captain Smith and delivered the verdict as calmly and clearly as he could manage. The ship was going to sink. And in his estimate, they had somewhere between an hour and 2 hours left before it happened. It was just after midnight. There were lifeboats aboard for barely half the people on the ship. For the first 30 minutes after the collision, an eerie calm settled over most of the Titanic. Passengers wandered the decks in overcoats thrown over pajamas, more curious than afraid, many assuming this was a minor delay rather than a catastrophe. Stewards moved through corridors, gently waking first- and second-class passengers, instructing them to put on their life jackets and come up to the boat deck, careful not to cause alarm. In third class, the warning came slower, and in some cases, barely came at all. Stewards struggled with language barriers among the many non-English-speaking emigrant families. Locked gates, originally installed to comply with American immigration laws separating classes to prevent the spread of disease, now trapped hundreds of steerage passengers in flooding corridors far below the boat deck, fumbling through unfamiliar hallways in the dark, searching for stairs that led up. At 12:05 a.m., Captain Smith gave the order that made the disaster undeniable. Uncover the lifeboats. Prepare to load women and children first. The order sent a ripple of disbelief through the crew. This ship, this unsinkable ship, being abandoned. And then came the number that would haunt maritime history forever. The Titanic carried only 20 lifeboats, enough space for roughly 1,178 people. There were over 2,200 people on board. The math was catastrophic before a single boat was even lowered. Even if every lifeboat left completely full, more than 1,000 people would have no boat to board at all. And in the chaos and disbelief of that first hour, most boats didn't leave full. Officers trained under an old maritime tradition of women and children first, in many cases interpreted the order to mean women and children only, refusing to let men board even when boats were leaving with dozens of empty seats. Lifeboat number 1 left the ship carrying just 12 people. It had room for 40. Up on the boat deck, the ship's small orchestra, led by bandmaster Wallace Hartley, began to play. Nobody ordered them to. Nobody had to. They simply began performing lively, upbeat tunes, ragtime numbers, waltzes, familiar songs meant to keep panic from spreading among the passengers gathering nervously on deck. They would keep playing, according to numerous survivor accounts, for nearly 2 more hours. None of the 8 musicians survived the night. By 1:00 a.m., the truth had become impossible to deny for anyone still on board. The ship's bow had visibly begun sinking lower into the black water. Deck chairs left unsecured started to slide. The angle beneath passengers' feet, almost imperceptible at first, grew steeper with every passing minute. On the boat deck, scenes of heartbreaking division played out one after another. Husbands helped their wives and children into lifeboats, then stepped back onto the sinking deck, choosing to stay behind rather than take a seat that officers insisted was reserved for women only. Isidore Strauss, co-owner of Macy's department store, was offered a seat in a lifeboat due to his advanced age. He refused, reportedly saying he would not go before other men. His wife, Ida, refused to leave without him, giving up her own seat to stay by her husband's side until the end. Witnesses later said they were last seen sitting together on deck chairs, holding hands, as the ship continued to sink beneath them. Benjamin Guggenheim, one of the wealthiest men aboard, changed out of his life jacket and into formal evening wear, reportedly telling a steward that he and his valet were dressed in their best and prepared to go down like gentlemen. Down in third class, the scene was far more desperate and far less composed. Families searched frantically through flooding corridors for stairways to the boat deck, some finding their path blocked by locked gates or confused, contradictory instructions from overwhelmed crew members. Many third-class passengers never made it above decks at all before the final plunge. Meanwhile, roughly 10 miles away, the SS Californian sat motionless in the ice field, her wireless operator asleep, her crew watching distant white flares rising into the sky from an unknown ship on the horizon, uncertain what they meant, assuming they might simply be fireworks or a signal of celebration. They were, in fact, Titanic's distress rockets, the last desperate signal of a dying ship, fired again and again into the black sky, watched by a vessel close enough to have potentially saved hundreds of lives. The Californian never came. By 2:00 a.m., the last lifeboats had been lowered. Roughly 1,500 people remained aboard a ship that had less than 20 minutes left to live. At approximately 2:18 a.m. on the morning of April 15, 1912, the Titanic's bow had sunk so far beneath the waves that the ocean began pouring over the forward well deck and rushing toward the ship's superstructure. The immense weight of water flooding forward finally overwhelmed the hull's structural limits. Witnesses in nearby lifeboats described a horrifying sequence of events, the ship's lights flickering once, then going completely dark, followed by a deep, tearing groan of metal as the Titanic's hull began to break apart under its own weight, the stern rising higher and higher into the night sky as the bow continued its plunge toward the ocean floor. For a few surreal, terrible seconds, the Titanic's stern hung nearly vertical against the stars, propellers exposed to open air, before the ship finally split in two. The bow section sank first, diving toward the seabed nearly 2.5 miles below. The stern, briefly more buoyant, settled back down onto the surface of the water for a few moments before flooding rapidly and following the bow into the darkness. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic disappeared beneath the surface of the North Atlantic entirely. More than 1,500 people were still in the water, or clinging to wreckage. Survivors in nearby lifeboats described the sound that followed as the most horrifying part of the entire night. Not silence, but screaming. Hundreds of voices crying out across the freezing water, calling for help, for family members, for anyone. The ocean's temperature that night was approximately 28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to cause fatal hypothermia in as little as 15 to 30 minutes. Tragically, most of the lifeboats that had already launched, many only half full, did not row back to help the people in the water, out of fear that swimmers would swarm and capsize the boats. Only one lifeboat eventually returned to search for survivors. By the time it did, the cries had almost entirely stopped. Nearly all of the more than 1,500 people left in the water had already died. More than an hour after Titanic disappeared beneath the waves, the RMS Carpathia, a Cunard liner that had received Titanic's distress call and raced roughly 58 miles through the same dangerous ice field at significant risk to itself, finally arrived at the scene around 4:00 a.m. Under the command of Captain Arthur Rostron, the Carpathia's crew worked for hours pulling survivors from the 20 lifeboats scattered across the freezing debris-strewn water. In total, 705 people survived the sinking of the Titanic. More than 1,500 did not. The survivors, exhausted, freezing, and in a state of shock many would carry for the rest of their lives, were brought aboard the Carpathia and eventually delivered to New York City on April 18, 1912, greeted by a stunned crowd of tens of thousands and a media firestorm that would never fully fade. News of the disaster had already reached the world days earlier, though early reports, based on garbled wireless messages, initially claimed the Titanic had survived the collision and was being towed to safety. Families waited outside newspaper offices for hours, watching corrected headlines slowly reveal the true, devastating scope of what had happened. In the weeks that followed, both the United States Senate and the British Board of Trade launched formal inquiries into the disaster, questioning surviving officers, crew members, and White Star Line executives, including Chairman J. Bruce Ismay himself, who had survived by boarding one of the final lifeboats, a decision that would follow him with public scorn and accusations of cowardice for the rest of his life. The inquiries exposed a devastating chain of failures: insufficient lifeboats, ignored ice warnings, a wireless operator too busy sending passenger telegrams to properly relay critical safety information, a nearby ship whose crew mistook distress flares for celebration, and whose radio operator had gone to sleep. The findings led directly to sweeping international reforms. Maritime law now required ships to carry enough lifeboats for every single person aboard. 24-hour wireless radio watch became mandatory on passenger vessels. An international ice patrol was established to monitor and report dangerous ice conditions in shipping lanes, a patrol that, remarkably, continues to operate in the North Atlantic to this day. The Titanic had sailed as a symbol of human confidence and progress. It sank as a permanent lesson in human arrogance. For 73 years, the Titanic's exact location remained one of the great unsolved mysteries of the 20th century, resting somewhere in over 12,000 feet of frigid darkness, far beyond the reach of any diving technology of its era. Then, in September of 1985, a joint American and French expedition led by oceanographer Robert Ballard, using an experimental deep-sea exploration vehicle, finally located the wreck. What they found stunned the world. The Titanic had not survived intact, as many had imagined. The ship rested on the ocean floor in two enormous, separate sections, the bow eerily preserved, its railings and forward structure still recognizable, sitting upright in the mud, as though the ship had simply come to rest there. The stern nearby was a mangled, twisted ruin, torn apart by the pressure of its final plunge to the seafloor. Scattered across a debris field spanning miles between the two sections lay thousands of ordinary objects, frozen in time. Shoes, still paired together where their owners' bodies had long since dissolved into the sea. Dishware from the first-class dining saloon. Personal trunks. A child's toy. Ballard, deeply moved by what he witnessed, asked that the wreck be treated with the same respect as a war grave, and refused to allow any artifacts to be removed from the site during his expedition. Since that discovery, the Titanic has slowly continued to decay, consumed by rust-eating bacteria that scientists now nickname rusticles, delicate icicle-like formations of rust hanging from the ship's remaining steel. Some researchers estimate that within a matter of decades, large portions of the wreck may collapse entirely, eventually disappearing back into the sea floor from which it was, in a sense, born. The ship that was built to last forever is now slowly, quietly disappearing all over again. More than a century after it sank, the Titanic remains one of the most studied, remembered, and retold disasters in human history. It has inspired dozens of films, countless books, museum exhibits around the world, and one of the highest-grossing motion pictures ever made, introducing new generations to names like Jack Phillips, Thomas Andrews, and the Strauss family who refused to be separated even in death. Part of its enduring hold on the human imagination comes from its almost unbearable irony. A ship declared unsinkable, sunk on its very first voyage. Part of it comes from the sheer human drama packed into those final 3 hours, acts of extraordinary selflessness beside moments of unforgivable failure, wealth and poverty separated by locked gates, a band that kept playing until the very end. But perhaps the deepest reason the story endures is far simpler than any of that. The Titanic reminds us in the most dramatic way imaginable that human confidence has limits, that no amount of engineering, wealth, or ambition can fully outrun the ocean, or ice, or time itself. And yet, despite the ice, despite the darkness, despite every failure of judgment that led to that freezing April night in 1912, the story of the Titanic survived. It survived in the 705 people who lived to tell it. It survived in the reforms that reshaped maritime safety forever, quietly saving countless lives on ships that would sail in the decades that followed. It survived in the wreck itself, resting silently on the ocean floor, rediscovered after 73 years of darkness, and it survives even now, more than a century later, in every documentary, every book, every conversation like this one. The Titanic was built to be the grandest ship the world had ever seen. It became something far more lasting instead, a permanent reminder of how fragile human confidence really is, and how much history can change in the space of just 3 hours. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the disasters, empires, and forgotten worlds that shaped our history. And let us know in the comments, which historical event should we bring back to life next?